Okay, so I've been writing my own pieces generally for this little ad hoc amateur Hitchcock retrospective, and I did want to include during the retrospective readings of others' writings. Obviously, if you've seen the Man Who Knew Too Much upload, that essentially mostly consisted of me reading out fairly lengthy Zizek pieces, it turned out. But what I wanted to do with The Lodger in this 1927 film is firstly talk about how Hitchcock, this film really proves, especially in the long run, that Hitchcock was as creatively technical as any filmmaker who ever lived relative to a context which he worked, especially. Um, if you want to compare him to more modern filmmakers, that's one thing, but relative to his peers, there's very few individuals who are ever as, especially in the, when we consider simply Hollywood or the English speaking cinema, so above the crop, because obviously we can consider firstly how The Lodger is compared to other films of the 1920s of the silent era. Lodger stands out as a major, highly watchable, beautifully aged classic, dense visual storytelling, which is why I think films from the 20s, despite being silent and having intertitles, can age better for modern audiences, finer than films from the 30s, certainly, a lot of the time, because the 30s films tend to be flat talkies, which is sort of readily sort of rushed adaptations of popular theatre plays a lot of the time. Anyway, but no, what's important is the John Braham film from 1944, The Lodger. Compare the two films in order to witness how the development of film productions occurred. There's the evolution over the course of, what would that be, nearly 20 years, not quite, 15 years more like, 27 to 44. But more importantly, perhaps, I think so, compare John Braham's The Lodger, not just to Hitchcock's film / silent film from 1927, compare it to Hitchcock's films from around that same time. Hitchcock in the early 40s. Suspicion, Shadow of a Doubt, Spellbound. John Braham's The Lodger is a very competently directed film. But comparing it to how the Hitchcock films of the early to mid 40s are executed, there's no comparison. It just goes to show how, especially in comparison to, this 27 Lodger compared to the 44 Lodger, and then comparing that 44 Lodger to Hitchcock's films around its own release in the early mid 40s. There's so much about, first, what Hitchcock was able to do within the context of the 20s, and how, in general, I mean, this is a particularly technical and creative production from the late 20s, but I think silent films generally were highly visceral, visual, and tended to be, as I said, a lot less flat and age finer than a lot of films from the next decade at least, and to some extent from the 40s as well, I might claim. But this film is incredibly watchable for a film, old Hollywood, old Hollywood, was British, but older English language picture, older picture, and then any film from 1927 compared to a film from 1944, you can demonstrate the differences in the medium, how films are produced. Although, of course, when they're tackling the exact same story, you get an even more direct demonstration of this. I've mentioned this before in regard to, say, another 20-ish year gap in this case. Griffith's depiction of the assassination of Lincoln in Birth of a Nation versus how John Ford depicted it, literally 20 years on, in the 1936 film of his, The Prisoner of Shark Island. But yeah, that's enough of my worthless waffling. I'm going to read out some information from the Free Encyclopedia here, as I wanted to read out other people's work as well. rather than just talk about my own nonsense. The Lodger showcases many of the themes of Hitchcock's previous and future works. According to Philip French, writing in The Guardian, Hitchcock borders themes of the fascination of technique and problem solving, the obsession of blondes, the fear of authority, the ambivalence towards homosexuality in The Lodger. The Lodger is based on a novel of the same name by Marie Belloc Lowndes about the Jack the Ripper murders, as well as the play Who Is He, a comic stage adaptation of the novel by Horace Annesley Vatchell that Hitchcock saw in 1915. News of the film was announced by the British press at the start of 1926, and Ivor Novello was announced as the lead in February. Originally, the film was to end with ambiguity as to the Lodger's innocence. However, when Novello was cast, the studio demanded alterations to the script. Hitchcock recalled, "They wouldn't let Novello even be considered as a villain. The publicity angle carried the day, and we had to change the script to show that without a doubt he was innocent." In recollections such as these, Hitchcock presented himself as having been dissatisfied, but in fact, Who Is He has a similarly happy ending. Filming began on the 26th of February 1926 and 25th of February 1926, and principal photography was completed within 6 weeks. Because Hitchcock practiced film methods that mirrored those of German Expressionism, scenes would not run for much longer than 3 minutes each. According to Tripp, fresh from Berlin, Hitch was so imbued with the value of unusual camera angles and lighting effects with which to create and sustain dramatic suspense that often a scene which would not run for more than 3 minutes on the screen would take a morning to shoot. Tripp had recently undergone an operation at the start of the shoot. She wrote in her autobiography that as a result of Hitchcock making her perform repeated takes of one scene, she felt a sickening pain somewhere in the region of my appendix scar and had to return to hospital. Oh, yikes. In framing the shots, Hitchcock was heavily influenced by post-war horror, social unrest, and the emotional fear of abnormality and madness. The film was entirely silent, but words were not necessary given the visual method of storytelling. A memorable scene occurs when the Buntings look up at their kitchen ceiling, listening to the Lodger pacing above. The ceiling then becomes transparent and the Lodger is then seen walking on it. A fake sheet of toughened glass was used. According to the Criterion Collection review by Philip Kemp, this scene was composed of 65 shots in just over 6 minutes, with no title cards to interrupt, some disconcerting camera angles, including one straight down the staircase as we see the Lodger's disembodied hand sliding down the banister. Early in the film, the Lodger's room is shown filled with paintings by Edward Burne-Jones of nude blonde women who resemble the Avengers' victims, but among them is a painting of St. George freeing a woman from being sacrificed. This may be Hitchcock's use of foreshadowing to suggest that the Lodger is not the actual killer. Upon viewing Hitchcock's finished film, producer Michael Balcon was reportedly furious and nearly shelved it. After considerable argument, a compromise was reached, and film critic Ivor Montagu was hired to salvage the film. Hitchcock was initially resentful of the intrusion, but Montagu recognized the director's technical skill and artistry and made only minor suggestions, mostly concerning the title cards and the reshooting of a few minor scenes. Hitchcock scholar Donald Spoto, who had not viewed the director's earlier 2 films, described The Lodger as the first time Hitchcock has revealed his psychological attraction to the association between sex and murder, between ecstasy and death. Spoto also stated, Montagu's claim that Hitchcock's edit contained up to 500 intertitles seems likely an exaggeration, but he worked with the director during the summer months to tighten up the film. One of the other improvements was to hire American poster artist Edward McKnight Kauffer to design the animated triangular title cards. A successful trade screening of the re-edited film overcame Wolf's prior objections, and its theatrical success allowed the British release of Hitchcock's prior film, The Mountain Eagle. Upon release, the film was a critical and commercial success. In a review of the film in the British trade journal Bioscope, it was called the finest British production ever made. The Lodger continued themes that would run through much of Hitchcock's later work, such as that of an innocent man on the run for a crime that he did not commit. Hitchcock had reportedly studied contemporary films by Murnau and Lang, whose influence may be seen in the ominous camera angles and claustrophobic lighting. While Hitchcock had made 2 previous films, in later years the director would refer to The Lodger as the first true Hitchcock film. Beginning with The Lodger, Hitchcock helped shape the modern-day thriller genre in film.